In today's episode, we're going to look at the psychology behind the Disney phenomenon, The Lion King. We're going to specifically look at topics of trauma, guilt and shame, also how avoidance oftentimes is a byproduct of fear and trauma. And then we're going to wrap it up looking at this concept of exposure and how we address fear and trauma. I'm Jonathan Hetterly, a licensed professional counselor, and this is Psych Cinema. Psych Cinema is Shrink Tank's video series where I explore the psychology found in the films that I watch and love. Before we get started, two things. One, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen Lion King already, either the 1994 animated edition or the 2019 live action remake, where have you been? I don't really know if we can go into spoilers. Everybody knows the story. But finally, subscribe to this channel, click on the notification bell. That way you won't miss out anytime we drop new content that explores the rich intersection of psychology and pop culture. Now, I'm not going to do a review of The Lion King because the money it has made in its first weekend alone suggests people are either going to see it or not going to see it. I really want to explore more of the psychology behind Simba and his journey from running away, his guilt and shame, and how he overcomes those obstacles to find his true place as the leader, the king of the pride. So when we think about Simba and trauma, not only does he witness his father's death, but he feels responsible. In fact, his uncle Scar really deceives him into believing that it's because of the choices that Simba made that his dad died. And so he carries that sense of responsibility and guilt, and he's further traumatized by running away and leaving his pride, his pack, to where a lot of the caregiving and a lot of the support that he could have going through such a tremendous loss or even tremendous guilt, he avoids. And so with that trauma, you see then Simba really grapple with a sense of guilt and shame. And this is very common for folks that come into therapy or just are dealing with a lot of psychological troubles. When we think about guilt, it's really assigned to behaviors. When somebody recognizes, I made a bad choice, I made a poor choice, I made the wrong choice. But they're able to identify it to a specific behavior or choice. And then moving forward in life, you can correct those behaviors. Like if this was a poor choice, moving forward in life, I'm going to make different choices. And so resolving guilt oftentimes is less burdensome than when somebody internalizes it and it becomes shame. And shame is really when poor choices, bad choices, like I made a bad decision, becomes globalized. It becomes a part of their core identity. So instead of I made a bad choice, that would be Simba really seeing himself as I am a bad person. And we see that with Simba because he doesn't see himself as worthy of taking on the role of king because of what happened, because of what he did. He believes that there are certain choices or behaviors that cancel out or disqualify you from ever being worthy or in some ways redeemable. And so then we see what Simba does is he runs away, which really in a lot of ways is a form of avoidance. And that is something that we see often in folks dealing with trauma or people that are just grappling with fear and anxiety, because it's a natural defense mechanism, and quite honestly, it's the defense mechanism that makes the most sense and is the less challenging. Avoidance, withdrawing, running away from whatever is difficult or whatever makes you scared. And so we see that with Simba. He runs away. And the interesting thing is then he meets up with his friends, Pumbaa and Timon, and they have this wonderful sort of mantra in the way that they kind of organize their life, which is Hakuna Matata, no worries. And in some ways that really helps Simba when he's young, kind of in a lot of ways get past that immediate trauma and loss and guilt to where he would find himself even not worthy of having friends, or why would anyone ever like me or be friendly with me? But we also recognize when it comes to anxiety, avoidance, trauma, there's only so much of Hakuna Matata that works before it becomes avoidance. It really becomes suppression. It becomes really not even thinking about, not even acknowledging, not even thinking about the traumas or the fears or the worries, because it activates such tremendous levels of discomfort and escalating emotions. So eventually, Simba has to really reckon with what has happened in his past and what opportunities he has in his future with his life. And that's really where we see this concept of exposure. And we know from research that exposure therapy is really the foundation of addressing anxiety and irrational fears. We also know for trauma that something called prolonged exposure therapy is really crucial for people to work through that type of trauma. Now, we live in a culture right now that avoidance really has become sort of the automatic way that we deal with discomfort. So you see people in terms of school refusal or social anxiety or really not engaging in social interaction, and most of their friends are online or through sort of technological transmission. People really are avoiding discomfort, whether it be trigger warnings, whether it be safe spaces. Now, none of these things in and of themselves are bad, but there only becomes a certain point where avoidance is effective and helpful, or when the anxiety and when the fear continues to grow and manifests itself in a larger sense. So at some point, for people to deal with trauma, for people to deal with anxiety, we have to address it. And it's not simply facing your fears. It's not necessarily overcoming your fears, because avoidance is a healthy defense mechanism to a certain point. But what it really is about is the more we avoid, the more than even thinking about a negative effect activates such distressing emotions. And exposure is really about how the brain works with desensitization. The more we're exposed to something in a very deliberate and controlled manner, the more our brain, our senses becomes exposed to that distress. But then we can recognize that it's not as bad as oftentimes our irrational thoughts and emotions make it out to believe. And so prolonged exposure therapy and trauma is really where they'll do talking about a past trauma, but in a present tense. So even doing it in a safe environment with a safe person, very controlled and methodical, so that you learn to experience some of those distressing feelings, but recognize they're not as powerful, they're not as all-consuming as oftentimes our traumatized or anxious brain is. And that's really what Simba ultimately has to do. He has to face his fears. He has to find a way that he can't just not think about them, because then we don't process them. And if we don't process our emotions, then we suppress our emotions and we suppress our thoughts. And really, at a certain point, you see in the film, Hakuna Matata no longer is an effective outlook for Simba to organize his life or to find true fulfillment and purpose. It helps him when he's little and when he's alone, but eventually he has to step into his true role. Otherwise, he's gonna be plagued. We see this. He's gonna continue to be plagued with guilt and shame and not process the responsibility or the growth that he can find by facing what happened with his father and with Scar. But I'm interested to hear from you all when it comes to Simba's psychological profile. Do you think Simba's growth and facing his fears was earned? Or do you feel like it was too quick of a turnaround? I'd be really interested to hear what you guys thought about the Lion King psychology with Simba. What do you think of the live-action remake of The Lion King? Be sure to leave your comments and thoughts below. You can also leave a recommendation of a film that you'd like for me to tackle here on Psych Cinema. Be sure to follow us on shrinktank.com. You're going to find articles, more videos, polls, quizzes that explores the rich intersection of pop culture and psychology. But that's going to do it for today's episode of Psych Cinema. Until next time, I'm Jonathan Hetterly. I will see you at the movies.